Hey, what's up, everybody? Today I'm talking about the best autofocus settings for your Nikon mirrorless camera when it comes to sports and action. All right, let's get into it. All right, everybody, glad you're here. Today I'm talking about the settings that I feel, or based on my own experience, have worked best for sports and action photography when it comes to my Nikon mirrorless cameras. Now, if you have a DSLR camera, things are going to be very different, and this may not apply to you. There's a couple things that apply, but really this is set up for mirrorless cameras, unfortunately. Some of my older videos talk about DSLR cameras and settings for those, so you might want to check those out. But today we're talking mirrorless cameras. In fact, I'm really talking current Nikon mirrorless cameras. So with that, let me get into it a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the settings that I prefer to use on my cameras. Right now, I'm using a Z9, a Z8, a Z6iii. I have used a variety of other lesser or less expensive, I should say, Nikon cameras like a Z30, Z50, Z6 Mark II. So I do have some experience with those and their settings. But the three I'm going to talk about today are Z9, Z8, Z6iii specifically. All right, so let's get started with this. And I'm going to go into my camera. I got a Z9 going right now, but I'll talk about any differences as we go along with those other models of cameras based on my own experiences. We're going to start off with the custom settings menu, and we're going to go to Focus A and go into that, and we're going to go down the line. I'm just going to hit the ones that are specifically for autofocus settings for sports. Okay, so first we're going to go into AF1, which you see is AFC priority selection. I like to use release. These other focus and release, focus. The problem with those is you're going to feel your camera stutter because it's not going to want to fire, especially in the focus mode, unless it's in focus. When action's happening very rapidly, you can't wait for that. It'll drive you crazy. So I put it in release and go for it. Okay, the next item I want to talk about is focus tracking with lock on, which is A3, and the three cameras I'm talking about may be different in your model, but A3 focus tracking with lock on. Now this one, it kind of depends on what sport you're on, but in general, with block shot autofocus response, I just leave it on a 3. Some people may argue one way or the other, but that's how I use it. As far as subject motion, either steady or erratic, I leave it on erratic because athletes tend to be very erratic when they're running around. So that's how I set it up, and that's how I leave it. And it seems to work pretty well in my experience. As far as the focus points used, I set it and I use all of them. Moving down to A5, store points by orientation. This one, if you're not familiar with it, basically depending on which way you've got your camera, either in horizontal or vertical in portrait mode, it'll retain those positioning whether you change positions. And it'll keep it in the same focus point, and it'll keep it in the same autofocus area mode. That's my personal preference. And I may vary my autofocus area mode between horizontal and vertical. I might have it on two different things. Okay, next one is A6, which is autofocus activation. Now, I like to set up my cameras using what's called the back button focus method. These cameras, there's a button on the back called AF on. Some of the less expensive cameras doesn't say AF on, but you may have the ability to set up one of your buttons on the back of your camera to use it as in AF on. And what does that mean is when I set it up in this methodology where you can see here the AF activation, AF on only, that means the shutter button does not do anything with focusing. All the focusing comes off the back button. What I found with sports is it works very well if I could separate those two. It may take a little bit of work on your part, a little practicing if you're so used to using your shutter button, but once you get the hang of it, I think you'll like it and you'll prefer it over using the shutter button for focusing. Moving down here to limit autofocus area mode selection. So there's a lot of different modes you can use for sports photography. Let's say pinpoint, single point, dynamic area, various levels of dynamic area, wide area, small, large, C1, C2, 3D tracking, auto area. Really quickly to go through these. Pinpoint, this is the new one. It only showed up recently on I believe it on the Z9 and the Z8. I don't think it's on the Z6. I could be wrong about that. But it's a very, basically like a single pixel that you're using to focus with. I don't like it. I don't see any point in it. Single point, just below that, it's mandated that you have it. It's built into the system that you use single point. I never use it. I like to use one of the other areas, and we'll go into that. Dynamic area autofocus small is a box with multiple, focus points on it. And in that one, this is kind of one of the old ways of doing it. And this is very common in the DSLRs. My D5 had it, my D850 had them, and this is basically what I used to use with DSLRs. I don't really use it with my mirrorless cameras, at least these models, Z9, Z8, Z6iii, because the other autofocus methodologies are so much better. However, I don't discount it completely. This is actually very good for camera models that aren't as sophisticated with their eye tracking and head tracking as these models are. So like the Z50, Z30, maybe the Z5. It's also really good, even with these mirrorless cameras, with the better autofocusing methodologies. It's good when I have like a huge crowd of people come running at me, and I'm just trying to pick which one I want to grab. And instead of worrying about autofocus methodologies that try to track a face, I'll just grab an individual and move from one individual to the next. So it works well for that. It doesn't get confused. And I tend to just use the small. You could also set it with the medium and the large. Now, the ones I use the most is this wide area, autofocus small, large, and C1 and C2. Predominantly, I use wide area small for most sports, which involve a lot of different players running around on the field. The box is relatively small. The autofocus box inside my viewfinder is relatively small, and I can just put it on one particular player. If I expand it to the large, it tends to want to grab multiple players' faces. It can't decide. So I tend to use wide area small for all sports when there's lots of players running around on a field, or I have to distinguish between players who are in close proximity. If I've got a sport where I have individuals and it's just an individual, like say tennis, and they're moving around quite a bit, I might go to a large, so it gives me a bigger box. I have a chance to catch that player moving around, and I'm not worried about catching other players' faces and the camera being distracted by those other faces. Focus mode restrictions. I only use continuous autofocus. There's single autofocus and manual focus, but I don't use those because especially with back button focus, continuous autofocus just works great. So say I have a subject who's not moving, like in a portrait situation, I'll use my back button focus, leave it on continuous focus, get the person to focus, take my finger off the button so it's not focusing anymore. It's locked in that position, and I'll take the photo. So I just use continuous autofocus all the time. And I would never use single autofocus for sports with people running around, and manual focus for sure. So continuous focus is just all I use. All right, so now I want to go back up to the photo shooting menu. So in the focus mode, let's go down there. All right, focus mode, I only use AFC, which is autofocus continuous. And then AF area mode, we talked about the AF area modes. So yes, you do have all these options. This is just what your camera starts off with. Later on, if you're photographing an event and you want to change it, you can go back and change it. But normally I start off with the wide area small, again, depending on the sport that I'm photographing. And then autofocus subject detection options, I always set it on people for sport. The only way to change it, if I was doing like motorsports, I would put it on vehicle, and if I was doing airplanes, I'd set it on airplanes. But I set it on people and I just leave it. I don't put it on auto just because I don't want it to go crazy and grab something else it's not supposed to other than a person. All right, there you have it. Really down and dirty how I set up my autofocus settings on my mirrorless cameras. If you have a different model than what I'm just talking about, you may not have all these functions. You may not have all of those different autofocus modes. Once again, I highly recommend Most of the current Nikon models do have the opportunity to do wide area with face tracking. You really ought to test it out and see what kind you have, how well the model of Nikon camera that you have is as far as the face tracking. In my own experience, only the Z8, Z9, the Z6 III have adequate face tracking for sports, in my opinion. I've tried some other models like the earlier Z6 models, Z30, Z50. I didn't think their face tracking was very good at all. So test them out. If the face tracking and head tracking is not up to speed, or you don't think it's doing a good job of tracking, go to the dynamic areas and try that instead. You won't be able to do face tracking. You have to put that box on your subject in their face and chest, but I think you'll be far more effective than trying to use the wide areas. If you do things a little bit differently in your photography with your Nikon cameras, I'd love to hear it down below and why you use those particular settings. I would be interested in hearing that. In the meantime, I appreciate you being here, and I will see you in the next video.